Welcome to an O'Connor Institute Issues and Answers conversation about the Electoral College with Ned Foley. Edward B. Foley holds the Ebersol Chair in Constitutional Law at The Ohio State University, where he also directs its election law program. His writing and teaching focuses in part on voting system design, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, and electoral reform. Foley is the author of Ballot Battles, The History of Disputed Elections in the United States, Presidential Elections, and Majority Rule, and numerous scholarly articles on various aspects of election law. You may have seen some of his writing in the Washington Post, the Atlantic. He's all over the place. Ned, thanks a lot for making time and being here with us.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So I thought we'd start. I was doing some reading before our conversation about the general American public and their familiarity with the Electoral College. Not great. So maybe we could start with a very broad overview. What is the Electoral College? How does it work? Why do we have it?
Well, we have it because we haven't gotten rid of it, I think is the quickest answer. It was given to us as part of our original Constitution. So that's another reason why we have it. But the Electoral College that we operate under is a product of the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which was adopted by Congress in 1803 and then ratified by the states in time for the 1804 presidential election. And most people, including myself, until I did research on this, didn't really understand the significance of the difference between the original Electoral College and then the new one. New, it's not new to us now, but new when it was adopted in 1803. And so to understand how it works today, I think it's useful to think about the difference between the first version and the second version. The first version was created with George Washington in mind when we adopted the new Constitution in the convention in Philadelphia in 1787. They wanted to have a president who was separate from Congress, and the concept of separation of powers was very important. And so the president was going to be elected by a mechanism that was not in control of Congress. That was a very important point. But they also rejected the idea of direct election of presidents by citizens because they didn't think, given technology at the time and the young country made up of these 13 new states, that it would be possible to hold a national election, a nationwide election. So they wanted the system to be state-based. And so they created this kind of odd instrument that we've inherited called the Electoral College that would give each state a number of electoral votes equal to how many senators and representatives each state has. And then each state's legislature was in control of how to appoint the electors, these human beings who would meet to actually vote for president. Because we think we get to vote for president as citizens, but that's really not in the Constitution. The legislature gets to choose the method. Now, all legislatures currently give us the right to vote for electors, thank goodness. But that's because the legislatures have done that. The legislatures could appoint the electors directly, as has happened in the past, or figure out some other method of appointing electors. So it's a kind of a very odd, complicated system. But the basics are each state has the number of electoral votes equal to senators and representatives. They appoint the electors, and then the electors vote for president. And the original details were built with the notion that George Washington clearly would win the first election, as he did. And they were hoping that the various states would pick electors and the electors would vote in a way that would create consensus across this young country, because there were divisions between North and South, big and small, free states and slave states. I mean, there was a lot of division even though we wanted to be the United States. And they thought the Electoral College mechanism could achieve consensus, and George Washington was the obvious consensus figure. The problem began after George Washington had 2 terms, and that consensus disappeared, and we almost immediately got partisan fighting, which led to the reason why we needed a second Electoral College, which we can talk about if you want.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was the presidency of uh, who's president. It was after George Washington. Thomas Jefferson was the vice president. Correct.
Right. So what happened was
They
these
were.
political parties formed basically by 1796 was the first really contested election.
Yeah.
It was between John Adams and
Adams.
Thomas Jefferson, these 2 founders, um, who were both part of Washington's administration initially. Um, Adams as vice president, Jefferson as secretary of state. But then they fought like crazy starting in 1796. And the Adams and his affiliates were known as the Federalist Party, and the Jeffersons party was known as the Jeffersonians because he was the leader. Sometimes they were called Democrats or Republicans or Democratic Republicans. But the key point is that they were 2 parties, and they differed on things like financial policy. The Federalists was sort of the party of the bankers and the creditors. The Jeffersonians were the parties of the farmers and the debtors. So their economic interests. There was also divisions on foreign policy. The Federalists were aligned with England, and the Jeffersonians were aligned with France, as this young new country was trying to make its way in the world and was not a dominant superpower at the time. And in any event, so when Jefferson Adams fought for the election of 1796, Adams won. And the odd thing was that made Jefferson his vice president, even though they were not running together. They didn't have running mates at the time.
Right.
And that was okay. I mean, it wasn't, great, but it wasn't a disaster. The real disaster came 4 years later in the election of 1800, where, again, the parties had really entrenched themselves by this. And it was a rematch between Adams and Jefferson, where Jefferson beat Adams, but the rules of the original Electoral College caused Jefferson to tie with his own running mate, Aaron Burr. And you would think that Aaron Burr would have the honor and graciousness or virtue to say, well, we know that Jefferson's the top of the ticket and I'm just the running mate for vice president. But Aaron Burr was a self-interested, conniving politician, as anybody who's seen the musical Hamilton knows. And so he thought, well, maybe I can get this tie resolved in my favor instead of Jefferson by making a deal with the opposite political party. And it was actually Alexander Hamilton who rejected that idea and said, I hate Jefferson's views, but at least he has views and principles. Burr doesn't have any. And that eventually led to the duel, where Burr kills Hamilton. And so it was a huge disaster in 1800. Jefferson does get to be president, and basically it's Jefferson and his party that gets to redesign the system with different rules to make it easy for him to win re-election as he does in 1804.
Yeah.
And the details matter if you want to talk about how the second system differs from the first.
Yeah. So the big takeaway here, right? The Electoral College system that we use today is not in fact the one that was decided upon at the convention in Philadelphia in 1787, but is a product of the 12th Amendment. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about what that 12th Amendment, what was the design of the Electoral College? What was the purpose of that design?
So the key concept that Jefferson and his party had in mind was a version of majority rule. Their attitude was they earned the presidency by virtue of Jefferson beating Adams with a majority of electoral votes. And they wanted to put that principle into the new rules. But their concept of majority rule was complicated because of the federal nature of our system of government. And they did not adopt a uniform national direct election where just a majority of citizens choose the president. Their concept of a majority was you build the Electoral College majority out of state-based majorities. So if Jefferson is the majority winner in his own state of Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania, he accumulates these state-based majorities to get enough Electoral College majorities to deserve to be president. That was the vision, and it was what Jefferson had accomplished in 1800, but potentially might have been frustrated on, and what he was able to do by means of re-election in 1804. And so they put those rules in place, and they also separated the election in the Electoral College between the president and the vice president. So they're not running against each other. They can run as a ticket. And so the electors first vote for president and then vote for vice president. And that allows parties to run a ticket of the top of the ticket is the candidate for president, and the running mate is for vice president. And the key thing to understand about the Jeffersonian vision and where we are today is it was built on an assumption that states would use their power of appointing electors to reflect majority will in each state. That's in fact what Jefferson and his party did in Virginia. They changed the rules of appointing electors to make sure that Jefferson would get all the electoral votes from Virginia, that they wouldn't be split among him and Adams, his opponent. And they thought, well, if states have this power, the electoral votes from each state are going to reflect the majority opinion of each state. But they didn't lock that requirement into the 12th Amendment. That practice had developed in 1796 and 1800, so they just assumed that would continue. And that's what's kind of broken down. I mean, you might decide you don't like the Electoral College at all, but the thing to understand is it's not really functioning according to the vision it was supposed to, because starting in about 1828, in the era of Andrew Jackson, states moved away from requiring majority votes at the state level to appoint electors. And most Americans sort of assume that when you vote, the majority wins. But that's only true if there's two candidates, because more votes is necessarily a majority if there's only two. Majority means more than half. That's just what majority means. Right. And we use this other term called plurality to mean more than anybody else.
Right.
And plurality and majority are the same when there's only two options. And the era of partisanship between Adams and Jefferson, there were only two options. And the real thing to understand about the Electoral College in our Constitution is it was designed initially in 1787 in the hope that there would be no political parties. The framers in Philadelphia thought that separation of powers would keep what they called factions in check, and there would be this fluidity of interests that would never coalesce into parties. That obviously did not happen. Parties immediately formed. And again, we immediately got this kind of two-party conflict that has been sustained ever since. But our rules allow for third parties, independent candidates, sometimes called minor parties or what have you. And that when that happens, that can be a deviation between the majority principle versus so-called plurality results. Because if you have three or more candidates and they all split a percentage of the overall vote, the person with the most votes might get 40% or 35% or 45%, but not necessarily more than 50%. And we may like that idea or not like that idea, but the key thing to understand is the authors of the 12th Amendment didn't think it was going to work that way. They thought there would be only two candidates because there'd be only two parties. And at the state level, there'd be a majority within each state.
Yeah.
And therefore, you could only get the Electoral College majority by accumulating these state based majorities. And they really definitely believe they want majority results. You have to get a majority of electoral votes to be president. If you don't have a majority, we have so called contingent elections under the 12th Amendment, which we haven't had to use since 1824, but they insisted on majorities. But in practice, what's happened since after 1824 and 1828, for reasons of history, you now can get a majority of electoral votes with less than a majority of the popular vote in the states that you win all the electoral votes from. It's very strange and very odd, but to give you, there's lots of examples in history, and this is a nonpartisan point. So if you go back to the election of 1992,
Okay.
the two main candidates were the first George Bush president, Bush 41,
Right.
George Herbert Walker Bush, uh, and he was running as the incumbent, as the Republican, and Bill Clinton was the Democratic nominee as the challenger. And Clinton ends up winning that election and becoming president with a clear majority of electoral votes. But do you mind if I just ask you a kind of a funny question? Can you guess or tell me how many states Bill Clinton won a majority of the popular vote in order to win his electoral college victory?
Well, I'm thinking Ross Perot was a significant part of that. So no, I won't venture a guess, but I'm kind of worried about the answer.
Well, you're right on point. Ross Perot is a third party or independent candidate
Yeah.
who's one of the most successful, if you will,
Yeah.
in recent American history. He doesn't get any electoral votes. He comes in second place in one state, and he gets roughly 20% of the vote nationwide,
Right.
which is a sizable chunk. But that's that kind of three-way split that I'm talking about. So it turns out that Bill Clinton wins a majority of the popular vote in only his home state of Arkansas, plus the District of Columbia, which has 3 electoral votes, even though it's not a state. Everywhere else that he wins, he's under 50%. And in quite a few number of states, he's um, under 40%.
Wow.
It's such a three-way split that he's getting 38, 37, 39% of the vote.
Yeah. Yeah.
And still, that's more than anybody else gets.
Yeah.
Uh, and sometimes I joke, his real name, Bill Clinton's real name is William Jefferson Clinton, but he's kind of the least Jeffersonian president, despite his middle name,
Yeah.
because the Jeffersonian vision is you don't get that electoral college majority unless you're the majority preferred candidate in the states that give you that majority.
Sure.
But that's not how Clinton got to his electoral college majority. And if we had runoffs or instant runoffs using ranked choice ballots, I'm not sure that Bill Clinton would have won in 1992.
Yeah.
It's quite, in my state of Ohio, for example, it's pretty clear, even though Clinton was the plurality winner, it's pretty clear that Perot was taking more votes from Bush than Clinton. And so if you had just the two of them, probably Bush wins Ohio, which is a
Yeah.
significant state in 1992 in terms of the number of electoral votes. That's not necessarily true in every state. The who Perot was hurting was you have to analyze on a state by state basis in our
Right.
system, but
Right.
he really definitely made a difference. And I could talk about other examples, including
Well,
more recent examples where a third candidate or a third and fourth candidate makes the
yeah.
difference in the same way.
Well, Ned, I mean, this is a really fascinating and important point because I think most people think that we're in a two-party system and that the presidential election is two parties, and it sort of is, but in many cases, as you're pointing out, the third party has been incredibly important. In some cases, determinative. There's an election in the 1840s, for example, I believe is it 44, 1844, where there's a third party candidate, and actually sort of siphons away anti-slavery votes from. Am I talking about this correctly?
Yeah, no, this is, let's go back and focus on this because I think this is one of the most important things that I didn't understand until I did research for a book on this. Nobody taught me about this in high school or college,
Yeah.
but it absolutely changed the course of American history because of a kind of a flaw in the Electoral College system that wasn't intended. I mean, again, they intended for majority results, but a three-way split in 1844 on the issue of slavery led us, frankly, to the Civil War. If you like, happy to go into the details of this because I really do think it's important for people to understand just how consequential the difference between a majority versus a plurality result can be.
Yeah. Well, it's Polk.
Yes.
Polk is pro-slavery candidate? Yeah, maybe give us just a very quick overview of this election because it is very important in American
Yeah.
history.
So again, it's 1844. James Polk is the Democrat at the time that they're the pro-slavery party, and he is definitely a pro-slavery candidate from the South. And people may have heard the term manifest destiny. That was his term. And he wanted the United States to be an imperial power. Remember, we're still a relatively young country in 1844. And his party platform was to go to war against Mexico to take territory by force if Mexico wouldn't give it to us voluntarily. I mean, it's not a proud moment in my judgment about American history, but we kind of need to know our history. And the goal was to expand the country westward for more slave states. In other words, the expansion would end up having more slavery
Right.
out west for economic reasons. In Texas, for example, the first prize was to take Texas away from Mexico. Henry Clay was the opposing major party candidate. At the time, the other major party was called the Whigs. They kind of collapsed in the 1850s, but in the 1840s, they were still the second dominant party. And Henry Clay he was for moderate abolition of slavery. So he thought slavery needed to come to an end, but he wanted it to come to an end gradually. And the first step to gradual elimination of slavery in the United States would be no expansion westward.
Right.
So and he also said the United States is a free, peaceful, loving republic. We're not a conquering nation. We don't take territory by force. If Texas wants to be part of the United States instead of Mexico, we can negotiate over that. We could maybe buy it like we eventually bought Alaska, but we don't just seize territory. So there was a clear contrast between the two major parties. But then there was a third party, which was called the Abolition Party, sometimes called the Liberty Party, that wanted immediate elimination of slavery instantaneously in the United States. And of course, from our 21st century moral perspectives, we hope that's the right view. But for 1844, that was too forward looking at the time.
Sure.
And even Abraham Lincoln, who was a protege of Henry Clay, said, if you're anti-slavery, you got to vote for Clay because that's the only realistic anti-slavery option. The purism of the third candidate was a guy named James Birney. Yes, idealistic, but just not realistic. And so let's vote Clay. But the problem is the anti-slavery majority split between moderate Clay and more purist Birney, and that split gave Polk the plurality. And so he wins without the majority. He wins with his plurality. And he goes on to fulfill his campaign promise of going to war against Mexico and taking Texas and taking more lands. That's how we got California as well. And so it changes the course of America. Ulysses Grant was a young general in the war, and he called it a wicked war because it was a war of choice. It was a war of aggression on our part. It was not a war of necessity. And but he was a dutiful soldier, so he obeyed the commandments of the commander in chief, and we won the war. But so America does become a continental power, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific because of Polk. But it destabilizes the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was this idea that for every free state, there'll be a slave state admitted, and for every slave state admitted, there'll be a free state. There had to be absolute parity between the two, but the westward expansion as a result of Polk's taking of more southern territories and expanding them for slavery, destabilized the Missouri Compromise, and that ultimately leads to the crisis of the 1860s, so-called Bleeding Kansas, and
Mhm.
eventually the Civil War. Now, we may have had a Civil War anyway, because we would have had to deal with slavery, but the way in which we would have dealt with it as a country and the circumstances would have been very different. If I mean, again, whether you're glad that Polk won or you wish Clay won or whatever, it was an unbelievably consequential election, and the only reason why the outcome is in favor of Polk instead of Clay is because of this kind of flaw in the implementation of the Electoral College system. If the Electoral College had operated the way the 12th Amendment and Jefferson had intended it to, Clay would have won because in the key states, if there had been any kind of runoff or just a two head-to-head, all of the Bernie supporters would have clearly preferred Clay to Polk, right? They're anti-slavery, so
For
as between
sure.
the two, they hold their nose and say Clay is at least more
Yeah.
anti-slavery than Polk.
Yeah.
Not good enough, not pure enough for our ideals, but the three-way split is what causes
Yeah.
the system to misfire.
One thing, Ned, that I guess we've taken away from this is that the Electoral College, designed for two candidates, breaks down when there's more. How would a nationwide vote, no Electoral College, just a nationwide vote? You have the same problem there, though, don't you? If there's more than two candidates, they're still splitting votes. You're still able to win, not with a majority, but a plurality.
Well, you're 100% correct that you have to deal with this issue. And there is this risk if you have more than two candidates, you could have a three-way split. I mean, and in 1844, it's the same answer. I mean, the same problem gives Polk a plurality of the nationwide vote,
Yep.
which is not legally determinative. But if you take Bernie out of it and you sort of assume Bernie's votes would go to Clay, then Clay ends up winning both the national majority as well as the electoral college majority based on state majorities. But you're right. One of the reasons why, in my judgment, we haven't replaced the electoral college is because we haven't quite settled on how to make the choice between majority wins versus plurality wins. And if we were to have just a uniform national vote, what what the rules and procedures would be.
Mm-hmm.
If we had a constitutional amendment that called for a national popular vote, we could design it either way. You could make the rule be whoever gets the most votes wins, whether it's a majority or not. But then we risk elections like Bill Clinton with winning, a plurality with around 40%. There have been three major elections in history where the plurality winner has barely gotten 40%. And so that's 60% of the votes against you, if you put it that way. And it's hard to think that you have a great mandate if you're only getting 40%. And some political scientists and historians think of modern polarization and the problems that we're having as a society stem for Republicans not really thinking that Bill Clinton was all that valid a president, given Ross Perot and the fact that he was a 40% president kind of thing. I mean, he legally won, no doubt about it, under the rules. But my own view is that we ought to have a system that does achieve majority results.
Okay.
And you could do that with a regular runoff. France, for example, has nationwide presidential elections. And 2 weeks after the first vote, they hold a second vote among the top two finishers
Right.
to make sure that somebody gets a majority. It's sort of the way California runs elections for every other office that California does. So we could do a majority national vote if we wanted to, and we could use a California style runoff, or we could have an instant runoff using ranked choice ballots. There's different ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
you could simply state in the Constitution to win the presidency, you have to win a majority of votes, and you could leave it to Congress to figure out the best way to implement the majority requirement, which could then change by statute over time if you wanted to experiment with different
Yep.
forms of it.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out here too that I think today when a lot of people hear reforming the Electoral College or throwing out the Electoral College, they assume that it's a partisan thing, that Republicans want to keep the Electoral College, Democrats want to get rid of it. But that's actually just sort of recent. I mean, if you look throughout history, it's kind of like gerrymandering. The party that's in favor of it at a given point in time is the party that is benefiting from it at a given point in time, right? And it's cycled throughout history. There have been hundreds of attempts to reform or to change the Electoral College in Congress. That's correct, right? Hundreds.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the thing that Americans have most tried to change
Yeah.
about our Constitution. And it's come close a few times, but the rules for amending the Constitution are very difficult.
Yeah.
And even though, when Gallup poll, Gallup does all these polls and they polled this issue for, I think, 70 years or more, and always a majority, often a substantial majority of Americans would like to get rid of the Electoral College and replace it with a direct national popular vote. But you've got to get 2/3 of each house of Congress, and then you've got to get 3/4 of the states, and it's just never quite
Yeah.
happened yet.
The one feature of the Electoral College that I think a lot of people sort of aren't aware that it's not constitutionally mandated how states apportion their electors. So states make that decision. Almost every state, I think 48, it's winner. It's sort of winner take all, which essentially is what gives us the situation where we have where most states aren't in play at all in an election. Um, would a system in which states apportion their electors proportionally, i.e., if say California goes 65% Democrat and 35% Republican, if that state were then to apportion its electors in that way, would that solve anything? Would that improve the situation? Could that be done? Would it be done?
It's worth thinking about, and proposals of this nature have come up from time to time. As you say, it's not constitutionally required that states do winner take all. Nebraska and Maine have a version of split allocation of electoral votes. As we're recording this today, there's been a fight or discussion over the last week about whether Nebraska should change and go back to winner take all as it used to have. So it's within the power of states to do what they want. If a state like California did proportional, it would lose its clout, is the argument. I mean, there's kind of a hydraulic pressure, especially among big states, to let the entire state go one way or the other, because right now California, I think, has around 53 electoral votes or so, and if they can give that all to one party, that's a huge deal. If it were to split 60-40, you would just dilute the effect of California. So it seems that it would only be likely for that to happen on a nationwide basis. And for that, you'd probably need a constitutional amendment again,
Right.
because which state is going to kind of give up its clout unilaterally unless there's some kind of an agreement among states to do that. Details matter here, and depending upon the exact proportionality formulas and methods of doing what you're talking about, you either solve the third party problem or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in a state like California, where there's a candidate like Ross Perot, Ross Perot could end up also winning. If he wins
Right.
30% of the vote in California, he might get 30% of the electoral votes. And then you could have a three-way split among electoral votes with nobody having a majority.
Yep.
And then we've got that contingent election procedure in the House, which most people think would be undesirable to have to use because it's a very antiquated procedure. So Um, my own view, if it's worth talking about, is to adopt the majority principle.
Yep.
Um, we haven't talked yet about something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which you may want to talk about.
Yeah.
We could modify that compact um, to solve the third party and I don't mean, I mean, I think Ross Perot should be allowed to compete. I think everybody should be allowed to compete. But what we want is a competition that kind of is rational and makes sense. So you don't want a third candidate who comes in third to affect which of the first two wins.
Yes.
And if we look at the election this year, again, whether you look nationally or state by state, it is quite possible that Robert Kennedy Jr. could affect whether Trump wins or Biden wins, with Kennedy coming in third. But the way in which he comes in third could make a difference as to who comes in first. And a more rational system would say, okay, let him compete, but let's make sure that whoever comes in first is the true choice between the top two candidates.
Yeah, Ned, thanks for bringing that up. Let's talk about that interstate compact because it's been around for a long time, but recently it's gotten quite a bit of momentum. Maybe you could tell our audience what it is, how it works.
Yeah, so it's a very clever idea. Again, the Constitution says to be president, you need a majority of electoral votes, and that number right now is 270. And it also says that state legislatures can determine the manner of appointing electors, and that includes basically figuring out who's going to get the electoral votes of each state. So the idea is if states that cumulatively together have 270 or more electoral votes, they can collectively choose the outcome of the election. So right now, each state does its own thing separately. But what if states with 270 electoral votes all agreed to give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote? Then the Electoral College system would by itself convert into a national popular vote system without a constitutional amendment. It would just be the states with enough electoral votes agreeing to do it that way.
Right.
And as you said, this idea started after the year 2000 when Ralph Nader was a third candidate who affected the outcome. And people said, let's try to do something about that. It got a few states on board, and it's been gaining momentum. It's not yet at 270. I think it's about 60 electoral votes or so away from that. And it is unlikely to get to 270 this year. But if Americans perceive that the Electoral College isn't working properly again this year, it might get to 270 before next time, before 2028. Now, the current version of this compact or this agreement does not solve the issue of three or more candidates. It calls for the winner of the plurality of the national popular vote to be president. And so if you like that, fine. But if you're troubled with a three-way split of, 40, 40, 20,
Mm-hmm.
where the 20 determines which of the 40 ultimately wins, you might think, well, let's use this compact idea, but make sure the majority winner. And the compact concept could be revised so that the states that are all in agreement on how to allocate their 270 plus electoral votes say we're not going to elect just a plurality winner. We're only going to give our electoral votes to somebody who is truly a majority winner, and we're going to adopt mechanisms to make sure that happens.
Mm-hmm.
If the compact got to 270 that way, I think we would then have a nationwide majority vote without a constitutional amendment.
Yeah. Is it the case that that compact could, well, first of all, it's legally untested, correct? I mean, this would almost certainly go to the Supreme Court. Not clear how the Supreme Court would view this.
I think that's fair. I think you can. I said it was clever, and it is clever. There are arguments, I think, on both sides that are plausible to say it's just using the rules that exist to
Hmm.
do what the states want to do, which they're allowed to do, that would be an argument for its legality under the current system. Um, the argument against legality would be, yeah, but you're using the rules to subvert the basic state-based federalism structure of it. So we've got to interpret this system to achieve its own purposes, and you're kind of undermining its purposes. So
Yeah,
it
yeah,
sort of depends on whether you're a textualist. If you're a textualist on the court, you think, well, it complies with the text of the rules. If you more believe in purpose oriented interpretation, you might think, well, it's clever, but it contradicts the purpose.
yeah. And I suppose too, you could get a lot of people. Say you're in a given state, and your state goes 65% for one candidate, but then your state gives all its electoral votes to another candidate because that candidate wins a plurality. You've essentially ignored 65% of the voters in your state, which seems like that won't go over super
I
well.
think no, I think that's right. I mean, until it happens, we don't know for
Yeah,
sure. It's certainly plausible to say that the residents of a state say, wait a second, our state's supposed to vote the way our state votes, not the way
yeah,
nation votes, and so yeah, you could see a state getting mad if it contributed to result opposite to what the will of the state was, for
yeah.
sure.
So I think what we're sort of coming to here, right, is that the Electoral College designed to do a certain thing. Times have changed, and that design no longer functions in the way the designers wanted it to. It's kind of been a bipartisan ache, really, right? In that people have been trying to amend it for a long time. What I'm gathering from you, Ned, is that you think the best way to run presidential elections is to have this sort of nationwide vote with runoffs, or to have a ranked choice voting system. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, basically, absolutely right. I mean, I do think the presidency, especially the modern presidency, is an office that most Americans feel, belongs to the nation as a whole. And although we live in separate states and we care about our states, we're the relationship of the nation to the states is more nation oriented than 1787 or even 1860 or something like that. And so I think that we ought to have one national election for president, and there should be the expectation and requirement that you need a majority support to become president. And then there are different ways to implement that majority. As you say, it could be a runoff, it could be a ranked choice system. There's even a third way that you could do majorities, which is a little more of a new idea. I could talk about it, but the key point is that if you constitutionalize this majority principle, then everybody's expectation is, okay, to be president, you got to get a majority of Americans to want you to be president. And I think that's what we instinctively believe and want our system to do. And so let's just align the rules with our expectations. Is where I'm coming from on this.
Let me ask you this, Ned. This is a tricky question, but partisanship aside, is there anyone making, in your view, strong arguments, nonpartisan arguments, for why the Electoral College, as it currently functions, is good, or has advantages? Um, is there any? What would those arguments be? Is anyone making them?
Yeah, there are people. I mean, so Danielle Allen is a political philosopher at
Mhm.
Harvard who has talked thoughtfully about why the Electoral College has value even in modern times. Um, Again, it's not my personal view, but I think it's a view very much worthy of respect. I think the defense of the Electoral College is premised on a belief that the United States, the very name of our country, the United States of America,
Mhm.
means that we are not just one monolithic nation. We are a nation made up of states. And just like every state has two senators in Congress, regardless of population, every state is entitled as a state to be represented in some way in the election of the national president.
I
And
see.
so, whether you're from Massachusetts or Arizona or Ohio, you're represented as a citizen of the state as part of the presidential election process, not just as an American. That would be, and the analogy would be, look at Europe. I mean, the European Union is a union, but France and Germany and Italy all think of themselves as separate, and they wouldn't want some monolithic European president that didn't acknowledge the importance of those boundaries.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, we're different than that. I mean, we all, we could talk about land, but I think the history of America suggests it's different than the history of Europe. But if your sense of the United States of America is that states are fundamental and integral to our national identity,
Hmm.
then the Electoral College, at least some form of an Electoral College, does make some sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Um, So this will be a sort of last question from me, but what do you think are the chances of us in the next say decade having a new system of electing president, or is it just the case that because the Electoral College is sort of always advantaging one party or the other, that there's just constantly going to be a sort of partisan inability to make reforms that seem wise?
Well, I think this is unpredictable. It's obviously a challenge to adopt this change that people have wanted for a long time. So if you had to bet, don't bet your house that we're going to get a different system anytime soon.
Okay.
On the other hand, we're in a particularly um, fluid moment in American history, I think, given the nature of the political conflict and the particular nature of this presidential election, where you've got a current incumbent running against a former incumbent. First time we've had that for over 100 years. And then we've got this wild card of a third candidate with a very historically significant last name, Kennedy, but controversial within his own family as well as otherwise. And so I think there is an unpredictability to this election that could cause an outcome that in a nonpartisan way or cross-partisan way says we got to have it, we got to do something different.
Okay.
The system is not working, it's not achieving what we the people, a majority of us, really want. And we want to continue to have a democracy, we want to continue to have elections, but we want them to make sense, and we want them to make sense on behalf of the people. And so let's come up with a system that's sensible. So um, I think there is some chance that that could happen. Unfortunately, you probably need the perception that something goes wrong before you get the repair. You
Mm,
never
mm,
have to wish for there to be a sense of crisis or something going wrong.
yeah.
But I think there is some chance that we come out of this fall's election into 2025 with a strong impetus that we need a new system.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Well, Ned, thank you so much for taking time to clarify what is a by any I mean a complicated system for electing presidents, and that people really need to sort of understand how we elect our presidents, and the ways in which maybe it works and the ways in which maybe it could work better. So I really appreciate you taking the time to help us understand those things.
Well, I appreciate the time as well, and I hope that this conversation does cause people to reflect. What is it that we want our elections to do? What kind of country do we think we want to have, and how do we want our presidential elections to reflect the kind of country we want to have? Because we shouldn't do this on autopilot, right? The other thing about the Electoral College that we have, it's not the architect of any single vision. It's an accident of an accumulation of historical events. Uh,
Sure.
and it's too important in office, and our collective self-government is too important just to do on autopilot when it was nobody's intention that it kind of operate this way. So we should collectively decide what is it that we want our system to do, and bring about that system so we can achieve our own self-government together.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thanks, Ned. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.